All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. It's April 6th, 2023. And this week, Dinesh is going to present on SuzieQ. And thank you for joining and presenting to anybody that's out there. At any time, if you have questions, please do not hesitate to ask them. You don't have to save them to the end. If you do not want to come off of mute, that's okay as well. Go ahead and drop them in the chat. We'll be paying attention to that. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Dinesh.
Thank you so much, Joel and Nick, for inviting me to talk about SuzieQ. It's something I've been doing for a little while now. It's a little labor of love, and it's good to see it being appreciated. So thanks, everyone, for taking time out of their busy days. I know how busy people are. So thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to come listen to me. I hope to make this interesting to you all. So the name SuzieQ, obviously, for those of you who are not old enough to know it, comes from the CCR song. I was listening to it when I was thinking about it, so that's where the title comes from. What I thought about, there's a lot of material to cover and usually takes me a while. So what I was planning to do today is see how fast I can get through, but take the first 45 minutes to go through the presentation, then jump into a live demo where we could kind of take a look at things so people can ask me questions, etc. Please feel free to ask me questions, as many as you want whenever we start. If I feel like we are getting delayed, I'll kind of suggest we move on, but otherwise, I'm very happy to take questions. With that said, what are the three key takeaways for me if you guys leave this place? The three key takeaways for me are, and I've heard this repeatedly from different users, customers. The primary use cases are, or the primary key takeaways are, SuzieQ allows you to access information without the risk of logging into devices. Whether you're senior engineers who are nervous about handing control to junior engineers, whether you are network operators who have to give control to outside vendors for whatever reason, people are just more comfortable, or you want to just give to other people inside your org, like in the compute space. That's one of the primary things that a lot of people find very useful about SuzieQ. The second thing that I've heard repeatedly is that SuzieQ enables you to focus on the task instead of the mechanics of parsing, coding, testing, etc., especially the enterprise version. And finally, SuzieQ provides people who have used it so far with a holistic view of the network over time. And this last piece is really where I started from. When I was at Cumulus Networks and I used to sit down shoulder to shoulder with many network operators, look at things, or with our own consulting team and see how they made sense of the network, I found that most network engineers tended to piece the network together in their head every single time something had to happen. Some of them, because of the experience, would piece it together. They would have a pre-set up map. They would pull it out of their cache, so to speak. But the cache could be corrupt, in which case they would get the wrong view, and then they would be off in the weeds sometimes. But this was one of the things that I noticed, that despite networking being probably the first distributed system of any kind, so to speak, almost, people don't have a holistic view of it. And they certainly don't have a holistic view of the network over time. And I felt like it was something that I wanted to address. And so that's why I started SuzieQ way back when. So since then, we have morphed also into a little startup because people have been asking us to provide support or add additional features, etc., all of which takes time, energy, effort, spruce up the various things. So we decided to do a little startup. For most of this presentation, I'll be very clear about what's in open source and what's in enterprise, so that way people aren't confused. But if you ever have any doubts about what I'm talking, where is it, just don't hesitate to reach out. One of the things I like to do is be honest. If I don't have something, if it's something I can't say, I will tell it to you, as opposed to kind of mislead you or to kind of be evasive in my answer. So the basic goal of our company has been to provide network operators with the data and tools necessary to troubleshoot, validate, and build healthier networks. This is something that I wanted to do at Cumulus as well, and we tried that by doing a complete different operating system, trying to do white box networking and everything else. But one of the things I've learned from that experience is networks, we need to start where networks are and networking teams are, not where we would like them to be. So with that perspective, what is SuzieQ? I think of SuzieQ as a network observability platform / application. It's first of all a multi-vendor platform. It supports various vendors, and we'll see what they are as we go through. And our idea is to focus on networks, whether they be physical or virtual. And the basic idea is for us to say we want to provide you a holistic view from Kubernetes to the cloud. We are agentless, which means you don't need to install anything on any of the devices. We have people running SuzieQ with 8 port switches from iOS versions running 8 years ago, to the latest honking Dune-based Arista chipset or the Cisco Nexus 9000 Fabric or Sonic. It's an open core solution, meaning it started in the open source, and I'm an open source bigot. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm an open source bigot. I love open source. So I'm going to work on making sure that the open source is always going to be something that people can play with. It's not a bait and switch. So what does all of this mean to you as users? Like I said earlier, the first thing for me this means is that we are willing to work, or specifically SuzieQ is willing to work with the network you have. It does not require you to have the latest version of something so you can use the latest protocol in vogue and say like, ooh, I'm doing this cool thing. So it's basically, the idea is network operators deal with real problems. We want to solve real problems and not be focused on the coolness factor. So with that perspective, we want to work with the networks you have. As an example, when I started, I was only doing Nexus OS version 9.3, which supported JSON because I wanted structured output. And a user came up to me and said, Dinesh, it's great that you're doing Nexus OS 9, but I can only support about 100 devices with Nexus OS 9. If you support Nexus OS 7, I have about 3,000 devices. So basically, it's not sufficient to say multi-vendor. You also need to be able to work with various versions of the same vendor. So that's kind of a variation on the multi-vendor theme. So basically, we want to work with the network you have. And the other aspect of SuzieQ that I designed and my team is working on right now is to make sure that the tool is always usable for network teams of all skill levels. You could be from that towards that end, we give people who are CLI jockeys a CLI. And that's a network-friendly CLI. It is not a Linux CLI. For those who prefer to point and click, we give you a GUI. And for those of you who are programmatic, we give you, and your DevOps ninjas, we give you a REST API and a Pythonic API. So you can access SuzieQ to do the things that you need to do, as we said, to focus on what you need to do, rather than worry about the medium through which you have to interact with it. And one of the things that I noticed right off the start is many of the networking tools tended to be point and click, or they tended to be everything has to be patched pretty much by you writing Python code all the way from scratch. I felt like both options were not exactly ideal, and therefore I wanted to make sure that I could attach to network teams of all skill levels. We started with a couple of use cases, but now it has spread to multiple use cases, and they span the entire network organization. Any questions on what SuzieQ is, its design in terms of the basic principles?
No, I think that's a good overview.
Okay. Moving along, what does SuzieQ do? I want to kind of quickly show you how the sausage is made, so to speak. I couldn't come up with a good analogy for how the sausage is made being a vegetarian. But anyway, so SuzieQ has got a universal poller, and the poller basically pulls all the different devices, pulls them down, and parses and normalizes the data. And then it timestamps the data and stores them in a database. And I use the word database a little loosely, but think of it as a database. It's a time series based, obviously. And essentially, once it's there, we use a Python API as the framework from which we expose all the other APIs, whether they be REST, CLI, or GUI. And all of them work off the same model, so you get the same behavior no matter what happens. If you use REST or if you use a CLI, can I get the same thing with REST? Absolutely, you can. In fact, one of the things we have is a CLI that is thin, where it uses REST underneath, but provides you the visual of a CLI, so you could run it on various machines. For example, if you're on a Windows platform and you want a CLI, that's in the works still, it's not there yet, but we have a prototype, so to speak. So you could use a CLI over the REST API. So it's a general model. We have got the whole model and we model it off of that so that the behavior, whichever way you choose to use it, will look identical. SuzieQ, one of the innovative parts of SuzieQ for me has been that from the start, I designed it in such a way that it is made up of loosely coupled parts rather than a tightly integrated system. That basically means tomorrow everybody is running GNMI or streaming telemetry or name the latest fashion fad you have. Happy to switch to that. As long as I can access all the devices, I don't care. And that does not change anything you have so far. It does not change the data you have. It does not change the API. It does not change the polar will have some changes, but that's pretty much it. You want to throw away the polar completely and replace it with a different polar, as long as you can match the schema, no issues again. You want to throw away the way we do the GUI, the way we do the CLI, the way we do the REST. All of those can be changed as long as the core interpieces, the APIs between each of them work very well. One of the beauties of this that's come out is a user wanted us to be able to access third-party databases, such as Cisco's ICE database, or their own, they have a few other proprietary databases. And the beauty of this is we can make it look native to SuzieQ, so you can mish and mash data from SuzieQ as well as the data from the third-party devices to look like uniform and then look at that holistically. And from the perspective of what devices we support, so today we support various versions of Cisco, iOS, iOS XE, XR, and XOS, AirOS, which is the wireless controller. And I put a star on that because that's coming in the next release. It's not there yet, but we have got the basic pieces working. From Arista, we do the Arista, of course. We support Juniper, various versions of it. We are also doing Junos Evo. I did not list that there, but we support Junos Evo. Cumulus Linux, of course, Sonic, and we also support Palo Alto Firewalls network. What data do we gather? We gather about 20 different tables today, ranging from basic device and interfaces to MAC, ARP, MLAG, a whole bunch of them. And we are adding new ones, like, for example, we're adding a whole bunch of wireless controller data that is useful. We continue, and typically adding a service to SuzieQ can take anywhere from a day to a month, depending on the complexity. So when people wanted STP, I added spanning tree to the enterprise edition, took me about a day. Same thing with DHCP. You asked me to add MPLS. We don't support MPLS today, but if you ask me to do MPLS, I suspect it will take me more than a day. So, but the whole thing has been designed in such a loosely coupled fashion and simple enough that we should be able to add services fairly rapidly. The same thing with respect to devices. It would take us anywhere from about a week, depending on the device, to maybe a month or so. So Palo Alto Firewalls, which is a kind of a weird device in some ways because you had to first access it via SSH, get an API key, then access it via REST, took us about a month to support. So what are the use cases that span out of SuzieQ? Okay, fine, I gather all this data. Fine, so can a million other people. What is special? What can you do with this data is the real key part. Because, as the moniker goes, people who know me also know that I love poetry. And for me, I've always thought that network operators have this classic problem that T.S. Eliot captured in The Wasteland with the famous lines, where is the knowledge we have lost in information? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? And where is the life we have lost in living? I think network operators are deluged with information, so it's hard to make sense of that information in terms of knowledge. It's hard to then be able to think of it holistically, so they can't create patterns which leads to wisdom, and they can't automate that wisdom so they can get on with their life instead of worrying about living. So what is network quotient? Basically, it's the ability to find anything you want instantly across time. And when I was presenting it to some a customer, they said like, oh, you mean Mike as a service? I said, what do you mean? They said, well, Mike is our smartest engineer, and he is able to ask, whenever we have any question, we have to go ask him a question. Now we'll just ask SuzieQ. So I was like, oh, cool, Mike as a service. So what does that mean? Basically, this allows you to view the network holistically. You can ask questions that you have not been able to ask before. As an example, one of the users told us, Dinesh, we have stopped asking hard questions because we never got any good answers. Now I can start to think about asking hard questions again. So you can ask things like, what are the min, max, and medium uptime of devices across models, across versions, across vendors? Were there any flaps in my network in the last hour? How many different MTUs do I have? And are there any failed routing peers? So some of these, you can think of it almost as a network CLI. You're just using from one spot, looking across the entire network and be able to look at things. I'm going to show you most of it via GUI because they make pretty pictures, but you can do pretty much any of this, if not more, via the CLI as well. Again, any questions, anything like, hey, can I ask this? Can I do that? Please feel free to stop. If this is boring, you're like, dude, this is all nice, pretty pictures. Move on to showing us some real stuff. Happy to do that as well. Just let me know.
Dinesh,
I want this to be of use.
Is this just on a dashboard, or can you get reports to the answers the same questions?
Yes, I will show you. You can get answers. They are not dashboards. In fact, I don't have dashboards.
Okay.
That's one of the things we plan to add. We don't have dashboards. We have a few standard ones, but a lot of that is automatically generated based on what you're doing at that time.
Yeah,
and I'll show you what I mean.
We've had a couple of really big jobs in data centers where there's multiple generations of switches, and MTU differentials have been, really hard to overcome relative to implementing something like VXLAN.
Yep. And so one of the things we have, for example, and I'll show you maybe, or I'll show you a demo if it isn't in the slides, is we can kind of save up context. So you can say like, hey, I want to set jumbo MTU, but what are my MTU sizes? So I can take a look and see, oh, wait, EOS is 9214, whereas NXOS is 9216. I guess that goes to your particular point. Can I find the MTU inconsistencies? Yes, you can do all of those. And those are all dynamically generated. And there are queries you can add and generate them automatically on your own. So this is not a pre-filtered, pre-selected dashboard the way most NMSs have seen are.
Thank you.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
To poll the information, what do you see? What polling interval do you use to refresh the information in your database?
So that is very much up to the user. So our poller runs in what is called can run in either a continuous polling mode or even in a snapshot mode. So snapshot mode is where you say run once, take a snapshot of the network as it is. I want to do a bunch of things, and when I need the next time the same information, I'll take another snapshot. So that's case one. Case two, in terms of polling, we have people who are polling roughly every minute. And this was in a Cumulus network. They were running Cumulus network, and they had about 300 devices, and they were polling roughly every minute or 90 seconds. There are others who poll every hour or every 15 minutes as well. So the polling interval is very much variable, and you can select it. It's not hard-coded. You can also select for each specific service a different polling interval. So for example, if you've got 1 million routing table entries and the poor box is going to die if you pull it every minute, and you want to pull the routing table only every 15 minutes, whereas you want the interface state pulled every minute, can do that, no big deal. Also, the way it has been written, if you say every minute and it takes 65 seconds to get the data, we don't fire the second one the minute is over. So now you're basically you'll never catch up because you're firing all the time and they're all ready and backed up. So we fire only after the first job has finished. We have processed the data, written the data, then we schedule the next poll, so to speak. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, sure does.
Okay.
Dinesh?
And we were making it more adaptable and things like that, so that we use the RTT to figure out, can we make it more adaptable, adjust it a little more, etc., etc. But we'd like to walk before we can run. And also take a look at solutions that matter to people. Sorry, I keep interrupting someone. Please go ahead.
Hi, Dinesh. Thank you for doing this presentation. My name is Arun Saha. I have been curious about SuzieQ and wanted to learn about this. And thanks to the Programmability and Automation Meetup that we get this opportunity to learn about it. So I have a question about this. The question is, when for running these queries, can we run it for a specific time interval that, okay, run this query, but give me answers between T1 and T2?
So yes, you can say, so there are two aspects to your question, and let me tease apart the two aspects. One of it is what people in the data science world call streaming queries, where they are waiting for the data, and as the data is coming in, they want to run the query over the live data and then respond. And then a second way to think about it, now we don't do that specific thing, but what you would call streaming. But what you can do is simply say, hey, I want you to tell me what changed between time T1 and T2, and we'll tell you that. What you can't do obviously is say, tell me the time change from now to the next 1 hour and keep the query running for the next 1 hour and then terminate the query. We don't do that yet. Does that answer your question? Did I understand your question correctly?
Yes, Dinesh, you got it. My question was mostly of the second variation. Like I know something happened yesterday around 11:30, so I want to know how things between 11 and 12. Yep,
that is the heart of SuzieQ. That is one of the most important things that I always wanted, what I call time machine debugging, to be able to go into the network and say what happened yesterday. In fact, it's funny, one of the people, when I was asking one of the users, hey, what is it that you find specifically useful about SuzieQ? For example, why couldn't you just write a script? The take of that user was, I can write a script that will tell me where something is today. In fact, I had a call today morning from somebody who couldn't find a MAC address, and they wanted to know, and I said, like, hey, let me spin up my CLI. I can tell you where SuzieQ, where that particular MAC address was, not just today, but where it was for the last 3 months, because they had been gathering data for the last 3 months.
Awesome. Thank you. And that makes me more curious about SuzieQ. Thank you. I will keep listening.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. So all that I just said, we have time machines, so you can look at data across any time period. You can access offline devices before they went offline. So we also provide topological information. We can provide topology based on the cabling, which is what I call LLDP, or we can do it based on protocol or the VRF, or even things like VRF, and we can do things like, even if you, right now when I say VRF, I meant VRF Lite, but we are adding the support for things that are also virtual, like L3 VPNs or eVPN, which is based off of a virtual topology, to draw all of those as well. And we provide a config viewer / differ. So because we capture configuration and we store it as well. So every time the config is changing, we'll store the configuration changes over time. So you can say like, hey, I want to validate that my network automation script really does what I expected it to do, that the differences between two leaves are, restricted to a very small number of things. Or you can say like, I want to see what the configuration of this device was today versus yesterday. All of those are possible as well. So those are all examples to me of what I mean by finding information. You're not troubleshooting, you're not doing anything, you're just trying to make sense of the world, so to speak. The next use case is troubleshooting, which was where I originally started from, but then, like I said, it's morphed into many other use cases. And so troubleshooting is basically to dramatically reduce the mean time to resolution or to fixes or to innocence. So from that perspective, we've added something called an endpoint tracker, which can find endpoints given an IP or a MAC address. And not only can you find that endpoint, and when I say find the endpoint, I mean find the first hop switch, and when I say switch, I mean L2 or L3 switch, that to which that device is attached, that endpoint is attached in the network today, or right now. When I say today, I mean right now. And it not only can tell you that, it can also tell you how it changed over time, where it was, how it moved, and if that particular IP address, you're looking at it from the lens of an IP address, if it's a VM that changed MAC, you will also see the MAC changes, all of that over time. The open source supports this as well, but if you have to do it at scale, it's something that's not going to work. So some people wanted the ability to look up the entire endpoint. They wanted the endpoint table across their entire network, which was like maybe 10,000, 20,000 MAC addresses. The open source, you'll be sitting there for a long time. The enterprise, we had to work out some algorithms so that now you can do that in 10 seconds or less. We also have a troubleshooting path trace, and this basically looks at the forwarding tables. And when I say forwarding tables, I mean the ARC table, the EVPN table, the routing table, the MAC table, all of that, and then the LLDP, all of those tables to make sense of the path. So you can trace a path from one address to another. And basically, this allows us to also be able to look at the path through tunneled paths. So for example, we can do it over VXLAN. So this path that you're seeing is holistically consisting of the L2 hop from the source to the first hop switch, the L3 hops, including the tunneled hops, and finally the L2 hop all the way to the endpoint. And one of the things that we try and do all the time is to allow you to view the information in a sensible way, in a way that you can absorb. So from that perspective, instead of showing you 64 paths that you now have to make sense of, on the side we show you here a summary. And all of SuzieQ's tables have a summarized information that gives you a quick overview of what is there. So you can quickly make sense that, oh, there are 8 paths. Each per hop ECMP is this much. The maximum path length is 4. The average path length, are there any MTU mismatches? What is the path MTU? You can get all of that information at a quick glance by just looking at that little thing, as opposed to trying to, again, piece together all of this by looking across 64 different pieces. And not only that, we also allow you to troubleshoot information. So in this particular case, there is a problem, and that's highlighted in red. And if you click on that, we will show you what we think is the problem. And in this case, it is the fact that the hop MTU is less than the source MTU, so you can potentially have black holing of certain kinds of application traffic if you're not careful. So you can also see here the input interface, the output interface for every single hop along the way. Again, our idea, our hope, our vision is to be able to allow you to do what you want to do as quickly as possible, efficiently as possible, and in a way that the medium is transparent to you, or what you're doing is transparent to you. I hope we succeed more often than not, but we keep trying to make it as simple and as intuitive, because trying to click 20 times to be able to get something done is as bad as logging into 20 boxes almost, in my mind.
Hey, Dinesh.
Yes.
It's good to see you again. I was wondering if maybe you could qualify how much of this is obtained through terminal console and SSH kind of executing show commands, and how much are you getting through newer mechanisms like polling Yang models and such?
Yeah, I'm old school. Everything is SSH at this point. There is REST API too, but pretty much everything, because 90% of the information I want is not available via any other mechanism. Either the SNMP tables are disabled, they are not supported, they just don't give me the quality, the depth that I have, I just don't get out of anything else. Maybe the newer Yang models might, but like I said again, I want to work with as many devices as possible and as efficiently as possible. So today I just pull everything through SSH or REST.
I recall seeing a thread that you were doing recently that compared something around async SSH, Paramiko, NetMiko, and a few other libraries. Yeah. Where did you end up landing as far as what modularity you used with SuzieQ? Which Python library did you land on? Was it efficient for your purposes?
Oh, I started with async SSH. So, I mean, if you do any bit of programming, you would know right away the fundamental thing with a polar is a network IO. That's the killer. That's going to be the one that's going to be taking more time than everything else. Everything else actually takes very little time in comparison. So I knew I wanted concurrency, and the best way in Python to get concurrency was async IO. So I started everything with async libraries, and I tried to do everything as much async as possible. So I used async SSH right off the start. In fact, I wrote that article almost 2 years ago, I think. And people basically were, when I said I picked up async SSH, I got a lot of, oh no, you should pick this other one and you should do all the thread management and parallelization yourself. And that's the other thing for me is I'm a phenomenally lazy guy. If I can avoid doing something, I'll do my best to avoid doing it. There are real problems to solve. I'd rather focus on that. Async IO in Python just is beautiful. It takes care of all the problems for you. You don't have to break your head over anything. And I wrote that mostly to kind of show to people that, you know what, you should be talking async IO, and anything else you do is actually not very interesting. So I landed with async SSH. I've been using async SSH for a very long time, pretty much from day one. And the maintainer of async SSH is an amazing guy, very, very helpful, very, very prompt. He's everything you would want in an open source library moderator or maintainer. Any other questions?
Yes, Dinesh, I have a quick question. So this anomaly.
I have a long answer.
So this anomaly is shown when somebody is finding the path. But let's say if somebody was not finding the path, so does this kind of anomaly show up somewhere as false or something? That is my one.
We have got, I will show you, there is a way to do that as well, where you can go looking for problems rather than doing it only within the context of a path. This specific one I was showing only in the context of a path. There are other things you can do. I will show you that in a few slides as we get to it.
And my another associated question was, is there any idea that when did this error happen? Is it possible to know that? Like,
yes, that also kind of exists to some extent in certain situations, but it doesn't go as deep as I think we can go. I'm still building up the molecules.
Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, so for example, to give you a sense of what I mean rather than kind of be very fuzzy about my answer, if you see an OSPF session not up and you run what is called an OSPF assert, I'll tell you, like, you know what, your MTU is off, that's why it's not running. Or your IP addresses are not in the same subnet, that's why it's not running. Or one side is configured as network point-to-point, whereas the other side is configured as multi-point, that's why it's not coming up. All of those different things I will point out. Or their peer on the other side is just not configured. So there is nobody on the other side with the OSPF configured for this interface, so you have no configuration. That's why your OSPF isn't coming up. But something like, you know, this hop MTU is less than source MTU, it's not very hard to say, like, you know what, someone's misconfigured interfaces along the path here. It's MTU consistent, but it's not path MTU consistent. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yes,
okay.
It makes sense. Thank you.
I mean, because the answer of, you know, finding out what could have been the cause of a problem can be fairly complicated. We hit all the easy ones pretty quickly and maybe a couple of more complicated ones, but that's work in progress that we are working on. Again, I want to be very clear. I don't want to kind of paint false pictures and show things that are not real or talk about things as if they happen when they don't. So I apologize if people are somewhat disappointed that this isn't, you know, like happy marriage, an intent that just says like, make my network work, and it just works. Okay.
Good. Thank you, Dinesh.
Moving along. Oh, sorry. Was there a question?
No, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Please keep asking questions. Makes me feel like I'm learning something and hopefully helpful. So the next part, and this was the question that was just asked a few seconds back, we also want to add we added another use case, which is validation, which basically is a way for network operators who are either DevOps ninjas or you are manually making changes to the network to be able to reduce the change windows and make those changes safe. And what we mean by that is essentially we provide a mechanism of writing asserts in a way that makes it very easy for you to be able to do what you want to do without requiring you to write code or know a lot. You're just expressing an intent. So to do a quick aside, if I can, this doesn't want to go. Okay, I'll go to the slide in a second, and sorry about this. Okay, there it is. So basically, not this. Now everybody got everything. Okay. Basically, the validation model is based on asserts. So where an assert is a declaration of what we expect of the network. In the open source, we basically have a few predefined checks which are not customizable and only some tables can be checked. Whereas in the enterprise edition, you can customize it a lot, and we are building a library of asserts. We have a CCIE, CCNA who's putting together a library so that we can kind of say, like, these are the ways in which you can look at your network and validate it. So this would be the place where you can go find problems without it being necessarily path related, as you were asking. And this is, like I said, it's easy to customize it for your network, and it's a no-code approach. You are basically writing just YAML asserts. All tables can be asserted, and you can do sophisticated and complex assertions, and this has GUI support as well. And why do you need customizable asserts? Because networks are not like unhappy families. They're all unhappy in their own ways. And so you have to be able to go look at the thing that is specific to your network in order to make it work. And so, like I said, there's an assert library, you can run it. And in this particular example, I don't know how visible it is to people. I mean, the screenshot might be a little spotty, but basically here is an example where we are basically saying, I want to validate that my loopbacks, all my loopback IPs have been assigned, loopbacks have been assigned an IP address, and the IP address is unique. So you only express two statements, which is verify that the loopback IP the loopback has an IP address and that it's unique. You don't say anything more. You don't need to tell us how to go figure out if it's unique. You don't need to tell us, and the same thing applies to a whole bunch of other constructs. We make it work without you having to figure out anything. You just assert it. And if you want to know more, please schedule some time. This is an enterprise-only feature. Please schedule some time. I'm happy to go over that with you and explain what we're doing. And of course, like I said, you can run asserts inside the GUI itself. So the question, is it a ready-made dashboard? No, it's not. You can write a new query, pop it up, and then have it be run, and you can see the outputs of it. And then you can go troubleshoot each of these. If there was something, you could click on them and go directly and see what the error was and figure out what might be the cause of it. So going back up, I apologize for this. Looks like I didn't get my slides properly set. We also have predefined asserts, like I said. So an EVPN assert, for example, verifies that all the VTEPs are reachable. That, for example, the EVPN standard does not have a way to validate the consistency of a VNI to a multicast group mapping across all of the nodes. We will do that for you and tell you if there's an inconsistency check. So an example of why is my EVPN not working? Yes, we can tell you why there is a failure in this particular case, if it's caused because of these reasons. For a given VNI, we check that every VTEP that has the same VNI knows about every other VNI, and if not, we kind of say like, hey, you know what, there's something wrong. This particular VTEP doesn't seem to know, is not known to the other VNIs, to the other VTEPs. We also validate that ingress application is used consistently for a particular VNI. If that's what you have chosen, we check some other minimal things like NVE interface, status is up. We do assert checks, and then we do things like validating in the case of NXOS, for example, that you have got a fabric address configured as the gateway MAC address so that everybody sees the same MAC address, and if not, your EVPN would not work and you wouldn't know why. So we catch all of those things and give you as a simple table, which you can then look at, and we'll give you a reason as to why that thing is failing. So you can then go fix it, so to speak. And from that perspective, SuzieQ only requires read access to any particular device. We do not make any configuration changes. So you could just give SuzieQ read access, and that's perfectly acceptable to us. And in fact, that's all we want. We don't want write access to the device. Any questions on?
Yeah, to key off of that. So the last meetup, I talked about using Kafka to as a message bus for network telemetry. If the asserts fail, is there a way that you could call an extension or some module that could generate into like a message bus so that event-driven automation,
that's part of what we're working on next. So it isn't there today, but that's exactly what we are working on next. We want to be able to tell you when things change. We are adding support for Kafka, obviously. We are looking at other things like 0MQTT and other MQTT maybe, but just to kind of make sure of exactly that, so that if there are other systems that want to play off of that, you can. So we are adding that. That's not there today.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? In fact, if you see the open source, there is in the configuration file a little patch which says Kafka servers. So we've done a prototype on all of this, just need to spruce it up, get it up into production. Or at least usability from an open source perspective. I suspect that would be an enterprise only feature because some of the predefined assert is in the open source, but the customization and all of that stuff is not there in the open source. So you cannot use like validate that my loopback interfaces are unique, the IP addresses are unique. We don't have that in the open source, so to speak. So the Kafka would be in there too in the enterprise. Any other questions? So we also have this other use case, which is planning. So when I started, I did not think about this, but users started coming into this pretty easily because of the fact that many of the queries just naturally fit into it. So we had people who were running to figure out, hey, I'm doing a network refresh and I want to see, for example, how many unused ports are there. I want to see how many unused ports in the last quarter. So it's a fairly complex thing that you have to do. You got to figure out what ports were not connected more than a month ago. Then you got to figure out which of those ports became active in the last month and subtract the two to get the result. So you can do all of those kinds of things using query mechanisms in SuzieQ. Then there are people who basically want to verify, you know, I have VLANs running everywhere because this is an old school design and I want to kind of prune back the VLANs. So I want to see where are the VLANs. And so that you can say, show me all the VLANs which have no MAC address. Or you can say, show me all the devices, show me all the MAC, show me all the VLANs which have no MAC address. And then there are people who said, for example, that, hey, I want to do planning, but I want to move from, I have Cisco right now, and I want to move to a Cumulus box, but I don't know if Cumulus can handle the number of MAC addresses that we have. And I said, how many MAC addresses do you have? And they thought they had about 40,000 and they were growing as a company. So they expected to hit about 200,000 MACs. And so they were concerned about Cumulus being able to handle this. And when they installed SuzieQ and actually looked at it, they had only 5,000 MAC addresses. So they didn't have any issues moving on to Cumulus at all. And I'm sure Cumulus can handle 200,000, but you know, they were concerned. And so this was a very specific thing. This is not a statement about Cumulus, what it can or cannot do, just to be clear, because I'm no longer there and I have no idea what it can or cannot do now. And like I said, from a usability perspective, we provide you a CLI that is very easy to use. It gives you help options as you are doing them so that you are not stuck with being able to you know, how do I type this? Do I have to hit a lot of dashes and go look at help and Google the way some people have to with FFmpeg, so to speak? No, you don't have to. We give you all the information so that you can use the CLI pretty effectively. Same thing from a programmability perspective. If you want to get, for example, all the interface information, this is how simple it is. This allows you to get the entire interface loopback information. So a simple thing, just say, get a SQ object, from get your SQ object, get me that particular loopback information for that particular namespace, and then you just compare that it is not 0, and you know that the IP address, that the loopback has an IP address assigned to it. If not, it'll fail, and the ones that will fail, you can then go look for it. I mean, this is using Pythonic interface, but you wouldn't have to do it if you were using the API, the custom asserts or anything else. And in many cases, the CLI is okay too. Any questions on this? And again, we follow the same model. So everything is get SQ object and get and a very few set of verbs so that you know what to do without having to waste too much time. So again, the benefits of SuzieQ are network organizations can become vastly more efficient. This is what I was saying earlier, that one of the biggest use cases is senior network operators can go focus on network. If you are an MSP and you're coming into a new network, you can easily run SuzieQ quickly, get information about the network and understand what the network looks like without talking to anybody almost. If you're a network consultant, the same thing, you can walk into a customer's network, understand more about their network than they could otherwise do very quickly. And now junior engineers can go seek the information they want without having to go bother senior engineers or ask for access to devices. Troubleshooting means NOC teams can close tickets more easily and more tickets. DevOps teams can now be more productive because they can actually validate their changes rather than having to do it, basically step by step, or, try and figure out how else can they do it with Ansible or trying to write their own Python code. Anybody who's written a lot of code will understand very quickly when I say writing code is easy. Maintaining is very hard. Maintaining across a network organization of people with different skills and people change, move, is even harder. And therefore, it's as long as you can do it in a simple fashion that makes it easy for new teams to come on and learn all of this, it's actually pretty good. So that's one of the things we focused on with respect to validation. Network and planning means architects can focus on what matters and why. And reporting and alerting is network teams can stay ahead of problems. So I didn't talk about alerting because we don't have that in the enterprise edition yet. We won't have alerting in the open source version, but we'll have it in the enterprise version. And so back to your question of Kafka, it'll come about when we add that. Kafka would be, put something onto a message bus would be just one other event when something doesn't work. You could say, send me email, send it to Slack, file a ticket in ServiceNow, add it to Kafka, whatever, any one of those that you want to do, or more than one. Any questions on the benefits? Anybody disagrees with what it does? Do people see other benefits? Okay, so where is SuzieQ used? SuzieQ is used in multiple enterprises in production today. We are used in sites ranging from 20 devices up to almost 2,000, not maybe exactly 2,000, but close enough. And we are used across different kinds of organizations. We are used in technology companies. We are used in MSPs to financials to industrial warehouses. We are used in networks ranging from data centers and campus to small ISPs and IXPs. So it's used a lot. And, as part of the open source, sometimes you don't really know who's using it till they file a bug. And then you say like, oh, you've been using it for how long? Oh, for a long time. Oh, I didn't realize. And then, of course, the ones that you know because of enterprise customers, you know them because they're your customers. So because of all the work that we did, we won the Cool Vendor Award by Gartner in 2022. And this was something we got, I wasn't even going looking for it. So it was very gratifying that people recognized what we were doing in SuzieQ and the specific points of like how organizations which attempt to do without it will have to cobble together a bunch of tools, which is time consuming, inefficient, and always changing. So a bunch of people who came to SuzieQ said exactly that we got tired of trying to do this by ourselves, or it just became too hard and we couldn't do anything else.
Dinesh, there's a
so
question.
What does
Dinesh, there's a question in the chat here. A question is, can it collect Netflow or SFlow records and run analytics on Netflow or SFlow?
Great question. Today, no, but because of the fact that we can integrate with third-party databases, we could do that by pulling the data from the third-party database. For example, if you're using some collector to store your Netflow exports, then we can probably integrate with that and be able to pull it, and then be able to analyze it. Again, the point of SuzieQ is I don't want to solve every single problem all by myself. I don't want to suffer from the not invented here syndrome where I am the only way you do anything. If you already got working metrics using Prometheus, using something else, I want to work with that rather than say throw all of that away and start from scratch with me. Or if you're already using an Netflow collector and you're pretty happy and you've got tons of data and you want to use that, I would like to be able to work with that rather than say throw all of that away and start from my SFlow collector now. So at every step, again, I want to live up to that promise of work with the network you have and the network team you have. So why use enterprise? Basically, enterprise is for production networks. We do a lot more testing. There are a lot more devices and services supported in enterprise that are not supported, for example, in open source. We have more features. And in some cases, we just have superior quality versions of most of the components. For example, the open source Polar compared to the open source Polar, the enterprise Polar uses about 80% less memory, 50% less CPU, and with some new changes, as much as about 30% less storage. And it is much, much faster. It'll also be more performant, more at scale. So tons of reasons why you should use the enterprise version. But you can always start with the open source. It'll always be there. And it is not something that I plan to stop working on or supporting. So call to action. It's great you heard it. It's very easy for you to be able to start looking at SuzieQ. Just do a pip install or a Docker pull and get started. Join the SuzieQ Slack channel. Myself, some of my team members, or the community itself is very helpful in answering questions. Please provide feedback. If you write code, please provide pull requests, request an enterprise demo. You know, one of the things about open source is, unlike many other organizations which might have large, FANGs can put out open source projects left, right, and center because their primary business is something else. In my case, it's pretty much me doing it as a labor of love. So I would love to be able to also put food on the table with this. So please request an enterprise demo, come work on it. But again, I would like to do that only if it's actually adding value. With that, I come to the end. If you have got more questions, I'm happy to take them, or we can do a quick demo.
One question in the chat: how does SuzieQ pull vendor-specific data from devices?
What does vendor-specific mean? Everything is vendor-specific. I mean, no two people implement EVPN the same way. Just look at how Junos implements EVPN and how Cisco, Arista, and Cumulus implement EVPN. They're all vendor-specific.
So the question is, there are a few data which is defined in the open config or YARN modules, which are open source, but those modules doesn't captures the specific attributes that a particular vendor has specified, right? So
exactly. One of the things I avoid like a plague is open models that SNMP has defined or any of them have defined, because having been at a vendor for a very long time and being involved, what I've noticed all the time is people take 6 years to develop a standard. In the meantime, every vendor, after the standard is defined, has added tons of new features because they want to be able to say, we have added all these values, none of which are supported in the standard SNMP or standard models, so everything is vendor specific. So I completely avoid that and say, I don't care about your defined models, I'll go define them myself. So I just pull every vendor specific data that they have.
Yep, thanks, Dinesh.
That enables me to be able to expand, and also the way the database has been constructed is it's easy to evolve the schema. For example, I don't support wireless controllers till now, but now I've added support for wireless controllers. You think about what should I do with MAC addresses, the wireless controller MAC addresses. Should I treat them as a separate entry, or are they part of the MAC address table? Well, I don't have a column called SSID or access point. No big deal. I just add them, and now suddenly I have it, and all my old data stays the same. None of it changes. So I can easily add new information to my existing schema. If I find something is missing, I can change the type. I can do all kinds of things without you having to throw away your data. So I work with every vendor, whatever specific information they have, I try and take all of that as much as possible.
So in that case, I think you might be busy for every release that vendor is going to publish, because you are going to use your own schema for each vendor.
No, I mean, the schema is always there. You can just go look for it and you will see it, because from your perspective, you can just ask for the tables. And we don't, I mean, the schema is always published along with every release. I don't publish it separately. And if we add any new columns or whatever, we can easily have a column that points to, we increment the schema version number, so you know what you're dealing with at any time. But you don't have to worry. We will normalize all of that for you. So for example, let's assume that we are using some old data and you want to get information about what is the access point on the data. You won't get that because it's old data, but you will get it on the new one.
This is just a quick note. How long did it take you to add Mac vendor OUI and the snooping table, Dinesh?
Oh, I support OUI, FQDN, all of that in the enterprise version. So it took me to add OUI, I don't know, maybe hours. The main problem with OUI that I recognized was that it was basically a longest prefix match now, because OUIs have more than the first 3 bytes assigned. And I found that none of the existing libraries work. So I had to write one on my own and be very fast, because the user wanted it to work across tens of thousands of MAC addresses. So it was very quick. So for me to add this kind of stuff is pretty easy. DHCP IP snooping table took me a day at best. Yeah, it's very easy for us to add in. It's not very hard at all.
Dinesh?
Yep.
This is Arun again. So I have 2 questions.
Sure, go ahead.
One is like you have an enterprise version and open source version. So how do you maintain the 2 different versions? Like how, generally I'm curious, because the same features are going to both, but at a different level of detail and sophistication. And let me also ask you
the same features are not going into both. The enterprise has a ton of new features that the open source does not have. Some things, you know, it's just software engineering and it's a lot of work. And that's part of why I say, like, you know, if you guys like it, use it, you think it makes a difference to your day in using SuzieQ, then please support us, sponsor us, support us, because we work to make all of this happen so that it's seamless to you. But we don't, the base is the same, then we make the change to the base. But, you know, if, for example, an enterprise user finds a bug, we fix it in the enterprise first. The open source release might not be anywhere nearby.
Okay, okay.
So we do maintain 2 separate trees. Some of the stuff is very common and it's very similar, and it started from the same spot, but it's, you know, in terms of trying to support performance and scale and all of those things, the code has diverged quite a lot. Like I said, the Polar is like 80%, uses 80% less memory and uses 50% less CPU. So one user who tried to pull down about 150,000 routes from Juniper, and Juniper is pretty bad at this because they send you very pretty JSON. They don't send you unpretty JSON. They don't send you compressed JSON like many others do. That's because they first converted into XML, and from XML they do JSON, so they do all kinds of stuff. Their output is generally very consistent version over version compared to some of the others, but it's very verbose. So because of the amount of data that we were getting about 500 meg of data. In that particular case, the open source couldn't keep up. The enterprise didn't even blink, just kept going, as an example.
Dinesh, since you talk about Juniper, have you ever tried telemetry infra as well?
The problem, like I said again, is my point is all of those stuffs are point in time. They are very new. They only do some things, not everything. Whereas 90% of the long tail of existing devices is really long. And it's pointless to support something that only works with, like, you know, 1/10 of your devices. So I don't go chasing fads. You know, I like what Jeff Bezos said a long time ago, but in a different context. He said, when people ask me what does the future hold, rather than answer that, I ask a different question, which is what is going to stay the same in the future? And in my case, the answer is SSH. The CLI will stay constant. It'll always be there. I can always get more data out of it than any model will give me. And in some cases, like Juniper, which actually has a good model, the output is so verbose, it's 10 times more to pull a structured output than an unstructured output from Junos. So again, I kind of don't really pay attention to those. I keep an eye on them to make sure that I'm not missing information so that I can add them. But then users tell me to, customers tell me to. But I don't go chasing about like what's going to be there, because Yang is going to change. Trust me, it's not going to be there tomorrow. And the models that are there today don't work with what the users are already, what the vendor supports for every single thing. And that's why the specific question came, I think, which is, what do you do about vendor-specific data? I don't have that info. Every data is vendor-specific to me, and I just pull all of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Dinesh, it does make sense. But I would advise that if you can explore the telemetry route as well, because in telemetry route, the data is very concise.
That's all good. When it becomes a little more ubiquitous, I'll be happy to go. This whole thing has been designed, SuzieQ has been designed. Telemetry has another advantage, right? Which is it tells me when things change as they change, and it doesn't tell me if things haven't changed, both of which are advantageous and efficient. So I want to take advantage of them. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that I want to stay with SSH forever. But unfortunately, I'm not seeing consistency come out of vendors or even their new equipment. Sometimes something is present in one version of the software, it's not present in the next version or in the other box that they support. So I'm forced to support. So when it becomes more ubiquitous, I'll absolutely support streaming telemetry. I love it.
Yeah, in case of ubiquitous, it's again bring down to the open source young models, which I don't think is going to be unique, common across all the vendors. So
yeah, that's why I'm not going to look at, again, I just want to say this. I want the data. I want to get access to the data. I don't care how I get it. If streaming telemetry is going to give it to me, I'll jump on streaming telemetry. Till it doesn't give it to me, I won't bother. I don't want to be constrained. This is something that network people alone, I feel, are obsessed by. They're worried about the model that a vendor puts out and the transport that a vendor puts out. A compute guy doesn't care. If I have to screen scrape it, I'll screen scrape it. If there's collect D, I will collect D it. If I can pull it through its own custom protocol, I'll pull it through a custom protocol. They just want access to the data so they can look at information holistically. And that's my perspective too. I want access to data because it's that access to data that in the end makes a network operator really see what they want to see and be able to make progress.
Dinesh, one question. Okay, Claudia, go ahead.
I was just saying that cascades down to us network engineers. I don't want to parse anymore, right? I want to add more value in whatever scripts I might be writing for a client. And so using SuzieQ has gotten me out of the parsing business altogether. And I'm really presenting, here's a little app. If the MAC address is on the port that the user says it's on, let the user change it, right? Very safe, very, very kind of low risk thing to allow them. And we can do that because now we can query not the switches themselves, right? But we can query the SuzieQ data set, validate that what's happening is okay under some guidelines. That's the kind of stuff that I can now spend time doing on because I'm out of the parsing business. And I've got data across vendors and iOS versions that's normalized. Sorry, I just want to throw that in there. I'm a big fan of SuzieQ, if you can't tell.
Thank you, Claudia.
Hi, Dinesh. So far we discussed mostly about the network, but can we talk a little bit? Can you share little things about the system where the SuzieQ is running? So I can assume that it is a standard server stuff, but let's say what is the primary observation like between the size of the network and between the SuzieQ, between the system where SuzieQ is running? Can you give some guidance, like how big network needs what kind of system to run SuzieQ?
Yeah. So a lot of people who start with SuzieQ, my recommendation is start with a piece of your network that you feel like you can take a look at and make sure is working, is consistent, you're happy with, because you first need to get familiar with the system a little bit to see what it's doing, how it's doing, etc. So most people who do that typically run it on their laptop, and I assume it's a laptop that's not Windows, because Windows can't do a lot. And so I presume you can run a Linux VM if nothing else on that Windows machine. And if you've got, my observation is if you've got 4 cores and about 16 gigs of RAM or 32 gigs of RAM, and you're not overloading the system already, the system being your laptop, you can easily hit about 50 to 100 devices without much of a problem. to be able to take snapshots. As the amount of data becomes more, so for example, 50 to 100 devices of an ISP, which is containing the entire internet routing table, is very different than 50 to 100 devices of a campus network or a small data center or a small IXP. So they're all different. So it's a little hard to be able to give precise answers. But what we do today in the open source, we've added this is, we tell you if the data you put in does not match what we hope is the minimum requirement, which is basically 4 cores, a modern i7 processor. Someone had thrown in a 15-year-old or a 12-year-old Xeon processor, and the thing was crawling. And I was like, but you've got 16 cores. I wonder why. And then I looked at it, and it was a 12-year-old Xeon processor. So we print out the versions, and we tell you, like, you know what, this looks a little old. We don't believe you will get the optimal amount of information or the ability to process with this. So please go to a bigger one. So 4 cores, modern i7, 16 to 32 gigs of RAM. I think, again, 128 gigs. The way we store data is phenomenally efficient. People who have been gathering data over 4 months, 5 months are shocked by how little storage space we take without destroying any record. I mean, we keep everything. We don't roll up every 5 minutes or 15 minutes. This is every single change that has happened, we store. And we can be phenomenally efficient. So if you're starting with 128 gig, it shouldn't be a problem, or at 256 gig, it shouldn't be a problem.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Dinesh.
You're welcome. So before we go, I know we are on top of the hour. I wanted to give people, I always like to do this a little bit, to give people a purview of where we might be going. And I'll be quick to show something. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Oh, sorry. So, everybody wants to play the game, and I've always thought that this was something that was very useful / interesting. You can do things like now say, ask what VLAN has the most MAC address. And, oh, sorry. Yeah, I need to export. And you should be able to get the answer pretty quickly. In this particular case, it's VLAN 1 that has the most MAC addresses. You can ask, what is the most common reason for reboot? And you'd get, oh, having problems demo. What can I say? The network is unreachable, it says. I wonder why. I guess the device on the other end is not responding. I can try one more time. No, the network is unreachable. So the other side is not reachable. But I had a nice little demo where you could basically ask NLP questions. We are working on that. So you can start asking questions using natural language queries rather than having to type in the CLI and everything else. It's obviously something in progress. But, I want to be judicious in my use of AI ML, and I think being able to ask questions in a natural language is kind of interesting in many ways. So that's something that we'll be exploring. And as a funny aside, someone said, hey, does this mean I can ask questions like, is my network effed? And I'll say, son, you can't handle the truth. And if you had voice assist enabled, it would say it in Jack Nicholson's voice. So, I want to stop there because we are on top of the hour. I'm happy to do more demos on the CLI or whatever else you guys want. Happy to do it. Or happy to take more questions, anything you want. I'm always reachable at that email address on Slack, on Twitter or LinkedIn. People know how to reach me in various ways. Or like I said earlier, get onto the SuzieQ GitHub page, join the Slack, download the package, use it. Any other questions?
There was one question in the chat here about plans to support other devices like Cisco ASA firewalls or F5 application delivery.
So we are adding support for all of those. So among the ones that are coming up, that come up constantly are Fortinet Firewall, Cisco ASA is in there, Checkpoint is in there. So we're planning to add support for all of that. But again, we are very much driven by our users. So as more users come on and ask for more of these, that's what we will be focused on providing. So some of our users want wireless controllers right away. So we're adding wireless controllers. I spent today morning writing wireless controller support, and now we can do a bunch of things with wireless controllers.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks very much for accepting our invitation to present here today. I greatly appreciate it. It's been a very interactive and very informative session.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. If you've got more questions, you want me to come back and do more live demos of any kind or anything else, happy to do that. Thank you. And thanks to everyone for taking the time out of your busy day to come listen to me. I hope this was very helpful, and I hope to see you guys engaged in other ways.
Thank you so much, Dinesh.
Thank you, Dinesh.
For everybody on the call,
You're
we will post Dinesh sent his presentation over, so we will post the slides and have those available. The recording for the call is also out there if you want to rewatch any parts. Thank you for your time today, and have a great week.
You
Thanks,
too.
Nick. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.